Good morning, everyone. Clearly, so I ordered a jungle gym set, and this was the closest thing they could find for me. I was like, I'm a little lonely up here while I'm wandering around. Can you give me a little bit more fidget widgets? I don't have enough between my pens and clickers. So if I just randomly start touching things, it's not my fault. Today we're going to talk about San Juan, Puerto Rico. A little bit of pirates as a preview of my talk for one of the sea days, and then I've got a lot of cool art, so street art and kind of a proper former museum. I'll talk about history, of course, as I always do, and you forgive me for that, and give you some of the sites. So do history first, and then some of the sites moving on. I am, as always, John Moore. I have a PhD in history from Tulane. Done archival research around the world. Thank you for those of you who came to the How Historians Do History talk. I talked a lot about that. I'm an instructor at Loyola University in New Orleans and occasionally next door at Tulane University. And then I own and operate Broad Street Cider and Mead in New Orleans with my lovely wife, Diana. So I like to give you a little color commentary on one of these kind of 4 or 5 aspects of my background to begin with as an icebreaker. And a couple of you have come up and kind of appreciated that in these talks, I don't give you 8 minutes of slavery in St. Lucia. I do kind of walk through and talk about things that aren't necessary or not controversial, but not just kind of these, look at all the beaches, look at all the pretty things. I give you a little bit of background too. And so I want to talk about poverty with with our cidery and meadery. Kind of a strange segue, you might think, John. Why would you talk about poverty, especially in the Caribbean? So in New Orleans, we like to think of ourselves as the northern capital of the Caribbean, and I've drawn a lot of parallels as we've gone through to places like, oil and tourism. There's a lot of kind of overlay. And why we opened the cidery in 2017, so I finished the PhD in 2016, got a regular job. I'm feral though. If there's, knowing laughter over here. If there is kind of the overhead lights somewhere, I start like breaking out. And even I was like, there's a 401k, it's not worth it. So I was kind of struggling, and Diana is like, well, if you don't like this job, figure out something else. Maybe there's some others. And New Orleans is similar to a lot of other places. It's a much larger city, of course, but that we've traveled so far where there's tourism as a major industry, which is relatively high margins, right? So you can kind of squeeze people, but fairly low revenue. There's not a lot of money flowing around, but that there is, you can actually make kind of a little bit of a living. So the idea with the cidery, I'm pretty good at making cider, we know a little bit about the business, we can come put this together, and we've actually gone to a couple of drinking establishments, surprise, I know, around our stops, and I'll talk about that in my rum talk. In one of the sea days, I think it's the first one, I have Rums of the Caribbean, but talk about these shacks. But we shouted out the owners. There's a certain wink and a smile. Bartenders have the same thing. They do shots of bitters and Fernet. Owners actually talk about rental rates and zoning. We get very excited. So we've talked to a couple of owners around the Caribbean, and it's the same story. So a lot of people either really are passionate about where they live, or in one case in Grenada, the gentleman at BB's, a couple of you actually told us that you went there, happenstance as well, had lived in London. Dad was from the island, moved back about 25 years ago, started a business, and then now Dad is mostly retired, son is running the place. But that's the game. If you want to kind of establish some amount of, not wealth, but income in a tourism place, owning a small business is one way. And so what that does, however, when questions of poverty, and I suspect I was a little hesitant to give you a wink when I did the talk about St. Lucia. I said, when you're walking around, it's going to have a slightly different vibe. You might be approached, right? Some of you are like, really? And then you walked around and probably saw that, that was the only place we've been so far. Or someone's like, hey, can I have $10? I'm like, no, it's fine. But this level of poverty in the Caribbean and how it's so kind of scattershot, island to island, is oftentimes just kind of a historical hiccup, right? Oranjestad and Curacao had a very different feel to Aruba, because one was, and still was, kind of a major port. We saw the naval activity going in and out. A lot of you might have seen it. There's a Dutch kind of destroyer that was probably helping with this U.S. question in Venezuela. And I'll actually talk a little bit about that too. Just kind of happenstance. Whereas Aruba, I mean, it was you had mud buildings up until the 1940s and 50s. So, and then St. Lucia, and then we'll see in San Juan, all of these stories are very different and kind of scattershot. The island of Haiti and Dominican Republic is one really quick, and I'll end on this. One side of the island, Dominican Republic, the classic interpretation is, one kind of history of slavery, and then you have kind of mulatto population on the other side, and that kind of neatly describes the island, hundreds of years old. There's actually recent economic historians and economists who have said, actually, in the 1940s and 50s, they both had military dictatorships. It was Dr. Can't remember, his name will come to me, but yeah, thank you. What was it again? Duvalier, yeah, thank you. On one side, essentially Haiti development funds, ruling elite took most of the money and then did a little bit of development. On DR, ruling elite took a little bit of money and did a lot of development. So they're both relatively corrupt, not great regimes, but what you have in one place, roads, airports, ports, and then in the other, not so much. So you can kind of have these accidents of history, and that's what you see in the Caribbean as you're going through and through. So if you're growing up in a place like St. Lucia, you have a very different view of life and kind of outcome, versus if you're growing up in a place like Curacao. It's very scattershot. So getting into now San Juan and Puerto Rico and writ large, I'll do about 9 minutes or so about history and background, break for questions, and then get into the sites. So, populated for centuries by the Taínos peoples, Puerto Rico was claimed by the Spanish crown in 1493 after Columbus's second voyage to the Americas. Ponce de Leon, over here on the left, who had sailed with Columbus on his second voyage, was the first governor of Puerto Rico, and later had disputes with Columbus's heirs, and also sparked the Taíno Rebellion in 1511. So this is a kind of more modern painting of Ponce de Leon being welcomed by Aguabana I. So there's brothers, so they're known as 1 and 2. The older one is 1. The younger brother, Aguabana II, the Brave, was one of the two principal and most powerful leaders of the Taíno people when the Spaniards first arrived on the islands. So he led the Taínos of Puerto Rico in the battle that is known as the Taíno Rebellion of 1511 against the Spanish conquistadors. Essentially, the indigenous peoples weren't super afraid of the Spanish initially. There were a number of misinterpretations. The Spanish overstepped, and so this sparked this rebellion. However, it largely failed, and by 1530, so 20 years later, the Taíno presence on the island had almost disappeared, with the census claiming only about 1,200 Taínos existing. So and it's hard to tell, but it's probably in the tens, tilting towards 100,000, but definitely tens of thousands of people prior to the Spanish coming. Skipping forward, I'll do the middle part when we're walking around the sites, to the Spanish-American War, 1898. So this war originated actually in the Cuban struggle for independence from Spain, which began in February of 1895. Spain's brutally repressive measures there to halt the rebellion, graphically portrayed by the sensational newspapers engaging what is known as yellow journalism, and American sympathy for the Cuban rebels rose. The United States kind of parked battleships in different places, and so the Maine, so like the state, exploded in Havana Harbor. This is the remnants of the Maine over here. Yellow journalism inflamed the public's opinion, even though no one exactly knew what happened. The US Navy, a few months after the accident in early 1898, said that it was probably an accident, not an act of war. The battleship might have drifted into a mine, but it wasn't malicious, it was just kind of confusing. However, the public didn't really care. So both sides blamed the other, escalating into the Spanish-American War, which was a very quick, one-sided war. It's only April 21st to July 17th as far as battles go, and with a peace accord signed later on in that year. The war was pathetically one-sided. Spain had neither readied its army nor its navy for a distant war with the up-and-coming power of the United States at that point. For example, in the Philippines, Commodore George Dewey led a U.S. naval squadron into Manila Bay, destroying the anchored Spanish fleet in 2 hours before pausing to order his crew a second breakfast, which is really quite the flex. And in Cuba here, I kind of have the map of the naval battles, but it wasn't much. It was mostly kind of chasing around one smaller fleet before the Spanish essentially capitulated. So this was roughly 2 weeks of various battles. So it was chasing around the island. The main naval base was here. Theodore Roosevelt kind of landed over here to push the Spanish squadrons out. And then quickly, again, a quick, very one-sided war. So following this, the Treaty of Paris with Spain resulted in U.S. sovereignty over Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, some scattered islands in the Pacific, and a protectorate over Cuba. Protectorates weren't fully colonies. It was essentially a temporary holding pattern. So it was really not until the teens or 20s that Cuba got full independence, but the United States still had places like Guantanamo, which is occasionally in the news. So that's on a tip in Cuba. The U.S. intervened in the Cuban War of Independence, which was essentially what sparks the war to begin with, and then also the Philippine Revolution, which is later the Philippine-American War, actually, until 1913. We get words in the English language like boondocks, actually is a Filipino word that is a kind of carryover of this, so out in the boondocks. And then, sadly, waterboarding is another technique that came out of this war. So that was actually something the Spanish and the Filipinos did to each other, and the Americans picked up the habit. But Philippine-American War until 1913. Interesting enough, Remember the Maine is actually, if you're ever at one of those like speakeasy cocktail bars, if you want to test their mettle, order this drink called Remember the Maine. And then if you want to complete the rhyme, to hell with Spain. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. It's rye, vermouth, cherry brandy, and absinthe. It's quite nice, actually. If you like Manhattans, things of that nature, it's in that riff. But remember the Maine. Moving on, and this is a nice, so this is the kind of walk slowly and carry a big stick. So Theodore Roosevelt, the big stick in the Caribbean Sea. And as promised, so this idea of our current intervention in Venezuela is part of a larger pattern of U.S. power in the Caribbean. So it's not an aberration, it's not out of the norm, it's just not a constant kind of military presence. And so what these books actually say is debt collector. So what this is saying is what European forces or European countries were doing is selling kind of high interest, high risk loans to Latin American countries in the 1890s. And then when they were defaulting, they would do this gunboat diplomacy. And so what this big stick diplomacy actually was in part America saying, Europeans, please don't do this anymore. We actually almost went to war with Britain over their policy with Venezuela in the 1890s. It was kind of a weird wrinkle. And so the British Guyana is now Guyana. And so that's also in the news because Venezuela is trying to claim 1/3 of it. That line that was drawn was actually between Americans and the British in the 1890s. So again, this kind of impacts our kind of understanding of geopolitics today. But this kind of gunship diplomacy was in part not Americans just simply bullying Latin American territories. There's a little bit of that going on, but it also saying, Europe, this is kind of our sphere of influence. And so that's kind of carrying over today. US and Puerto Rico, school begins. So Puck is kind of this, historians like to use it, wasn't super well read. It's kind of elitist magazine at the time, but it's kind of fun. So School Begins is a nice way to talk about early kind of colonial policy towards Puerto Rico. So the US takeover, military government initially trying to maintain a balance between central control and local autonomy. Empires are very expensive, especially if you have to intervene military to prop them up. Kind of we've seen this. I talked to a gentleman earlier yesterday about the kind of role of the US Iraq War, Afghanistan. These things are very expensive things to do in gold, blood, and treasure. So in order to kind of prop up and begin, so this idea of teaching Puerto Ricans the American way of government in hopes that they too would adopt the same system. Puerto Rico is in the sphere of influence of the United States. We have had an interest in the Caribbean since our founding, and so it makes sense. And what this is, so it's Guam, Puerto Rico, spelled slightly differently, Cuba and the Philippines, and then back here, kind of California, Texas, and then indigenous Americans, and then Chinese. Kind of the Chinese immigration question in the 1880s, 1890s was very much in vogue, and so all of this, and this is teaching US governments is essentially what the book was saying. I want to shift to you in the currents, actually gave you a nice primer of how Puerto Rico is a very unique situation in the United States, not wildly so, there's others, but the insular cases, 1901 and 1905, were a number of cases that essentially tried to answer the question of what is Puerto Rico to the United States. The United States itself was a colony, and so thinking of itself as an empire has always been an awkward thing for us as Americans. So how can America actually have colonies? What is that relationship to the central government? And so insular cases were trying to stumble through this. So this is the famous phrase for Puerto Rico is, quote, a territory belonging to the United States, but not a part of the United States. So the shorter turn of phrase, it is of, but not in. So that's, thinking of that kind of sets the tone. So as a territory, Puerto Rico enjoys various fundamental rights, like US citizenship, but lacks certain others. So Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, so these other Spanish territories that we took have a very similar constitutional structure, whereas places like American Samoa, which we stole from the Germans during World War I, is kind of how it worked out. Actually, the individuals in American Samoa are not US citizens, they're only US nationals. So even if they move to the United States, people from American Samoa cannot vote, whereas if people from Puerto Rico move to the United States, they can vote in local and presidential elections. You just essentially have to become a resident of Florida, Texas, Illinois, wherever you're moving. So Puerto Rican residents living in Puerto Rico cannot vote in U.S. presidential elections, nor can they elect their own senators or representatives to the U.S. Congress. They do have a non-voting member to Congress that's kind of can be part of committees, but still cannot vote. On the other hand, and in contrast to many U.S. states, only some residents in Puerto Rico are subject to federal income taxes. So that's kind of the pro. So they're not a state fully at all. They're not totally a colony. American Samoa, as far as comparables go, would be more akin to that. And so they're somewhere in between. This is also known currently as the Commonwealth. In 1948, I talked about the Commonwealth when we were talking about British islands, and it is a very different scenario. The US State Department, I think 5 or 10 years ago, even had a memo saying this has no legal meaning. Because Pennsylvania, if you're from Pennsylvania, it's known as the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's not really a legal term in the US system. But, so in 1948, post-World War II, this is also when the Philippines gained independence around this time, 47, 48, and then India. So again, the world is a very wide and complicated place, and things oftentimes kind of link up together. But in 1948, it became the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. In Spanish, it translates to the Free Associated State of Puerto Rico, which is actually more descriptive. Free Associated States makes a little bit more sense than Commonwealth, but here we go. It's an unincorporated territory of the United States. As such, the archipelago and island of Puerto Rico is neither a sovereign nation nor a U.S. state, somewhere in between. They've had popularly elected governors since 1948. The first was Luis Muñoz Marin, as shown here. A poet, journalist, politician, statesman, regarded as the father of modern Puerto Rico and the architect of the Commonwealth. He spearheaded an administration that engineered profound economic, political, and social reforms. So in 1952, a constitution was enacted that provided for internal self-government. This is something, so the US Congress has passed a number of laws. It really kind of slowed down after the 50s. Kind of setting up the constitutional arrangement there. In a most recent referendum, so there's been a number of votes on the island saying, do you want to stay the same? Do you want full independence, or do you want to be a state? It's not a legally binding vote, it's more of a getting the pulse vote. The most recent one in 2020 showed a narrow preference for statehood, but generally speaking, oftentimes they'll be split between these three camps. Keeping them the same, statehood, or full independence, because there's issues with all of them. Total area on the islands, 9,100 square kilometers, about the size of Rhode Island, and there's 3 million people where Spanish and English are the official languages. The island, speaking of poverty and an economic downturn, so starting about 2005, so in the 90s and early aughts, there were a number of tax incentives to spark. It was the pharmaceutical business, actually was a large part of that was going on the island. Those incentives went away, the industry went away. So from 2005, an economic recession has led to a net population loss. So there are less people living on the island now than there were 20 years ago. And in 2017, Hurricane Maria was the worst in 80 years, which caused tens of billions of dollars in damage and still has kind of knock-on effects today. So, I always like to give you a little 90 seconds or so. We're doing great on time. What do you know about Puerto Rico? Have you been here before? Going on an excursion? And then any questions or so. So turn to your left, turn to your right, look behind you. There's any questions, what do you know? A lot of you have come up to me and said, I really appreciate the chatting thing a bit, and it's also a nice way to do some Q&A, and even if you don't have questions for me, questions for others, so appreciate it. So, any comments, questions, concerns? Yes, please, back here. Yeah, so the question was, I've said only certain people pay taxes in Puerto Rico. I think it's an income limit thing, to be honest. But to be frank, I I didn't fully, I was like, I should look that up. I was like, that sounds like a weird thing. Yeah, so I think it's an income limit thing. But they do pay things like sales taxes, excise taxes, stuff like it's the federal, to the United States, yeah. Right, yeah. Anyone else? Questions, comments, concerns? Cowboys are playing the Chargers on Sunday.
Go Chargers.
Oh, you know, go Chargers. Yes, please.
It might have been 10 years ago that a hedge fund lent some money to Puerto Rico,
Ooh.
Mhm.
and they defaulted on it. It was a terrible deal, but they accepted it and they defaulted on it. What was the result of that?
Yeah, so the comment was there was a hedge fund or a number of funds about 10 years ago that lended money to Puerto Rico, and then Puerto Rico defaulted. You're right. And they actually, and that was one of a constitutional question that came up. So the Puerto Rico had to get permission from the House of Representatives in order to default. Other states, I can't remember what other states have defaulted on their debts, but states are more sovereign, and so they can actually choose to default on their debt. It's not a great thing. But this is this larger, when I was talking about an economic downturn and the hurricane, this is part of this larger story of shifting away from the pharmaceutical industry, which actually did fairly well for the islands, and then taking on debt, and then there's the default. I think it's an ongoing problem, yeah.
Did it have a major financial effect on the islands? The effect on the islands financially?
So what the effect would be on a default was the follow-up question would be, in order to go to the credit markets, it's actually much more difficult. So people aren't going to lend to you as well, or they'll lend to you at much higher rates. And so and this is part of the story, this was going on prior to Hurricane Maria's and lots of damages. And so why you're seeing not a lot of rebuilding is essentially you're not capitalized, they're under capitalization. So they're not able to lend as much as they would otherwise. So yeah, good question, thank you.
It's a chicken and egg problem. I guess the infrastructure falling apart from the hurricanes, and then you gotta get the money in. Nobody wants to put the money in if you're not managing well or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, so the comment was the chicken and the egg. If you don't have a lot of great infrastructure, it's hard to get loans for it. And so if it's hard to get loans, it's hard to do a lot of infrastructure. And so that's what's going on with those larger storms. And so this is why federal, questions like FEMA, and again, living in New Orleans, we very much are aware and keenly aware of what's going on with kind of federal funding and storms. And so that's why these are very important questions and going to have large knock-on effects. Puerto Rico, like a lot of U.S. states and across the Western world, also has a large kind of burden of care to essentially retirees and pensioners. Their kind of pension fund is oversubscribed, which that again is a very common thing around the world. So not all of these things are adding on to the problems of the island. Yes, please, last one. Yeah.
So the separatists attacked Congress in was it 57 or wasn't that what it was about?
Yeah, you're right. Thank you. So in the 1950s, during this kind of constitutional question, there was, I don't remember if it was an attack or protest or something in the U.S. Congress. And so that is part of this theme as well. So there is the kind of United States federal government largely ignoring, to be honest, the island in different ways, but then it'll kind of bubble up in causing constitutional crises as far as how the island is treated and understood and funded. All of this kind of bundles in together. So perfect. So I gotta move forward. I might have some more questions at the end. We'll see how we do with time. Thank you all. All right, walking around the sites, and I told you to get a little bit more history and background. So the Castillo San Felipe de Moro, or just El Moro, means promontory. It's the first fortification here, began in 1539 under the Spanish and expanded over time. By 1625, they were able to easily withstand a Dutch attack. Kind of have talked about the Dutch versus Spanish, Dutch versus English, yada, 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 in the 16 and 1700s. This is part of that larger story as well. Here's a nice city wall and city gate. Named in honor of King Philippe II of Spain, El Morro was designed to guard the entrance to the San Juan Bay. In 1983, it was declared a World Heritage Site, and over 2 million visitors a year explore the windswept ramparts and passageways. Map and topography, I'll have another map in a little bit, but be on the lookout for the sail into San Juan Harbor. So we get there around 5, so I'd say about 3:34. Tea time is perfect for it, actually. I know, right? Kind of lines up. Because we'll sail right past. It's an absolute gorgeous sail in, and then you kind of tuck in over here. It's one of those you just stand at the window, like forehead against the window for about 45 minutes or so. And so definitely be on the lookout for that. And the port is right next to Old San Juan, perfect for exploring the city. So these bays right here are the ports, and then you just kind of go up to the left and you'll be able to explore, and I'll talk about an area over here as well. Cementerios Santa Maria Magdalena de Pazis is an ornate, so it's 1863 is the most recent. There were likely other cemeteries on that spot before, but it overlooks the ocean. At the edge of the Morro, it's not as crowded as the fort. You might say it's a little dead out there. It also has killer views. But it's absolutely gorgeous, like peak Victorian. The Victorians really did cemeteries well. Other great groups, fine, but you get angels, you get ornate tombs. We really enjoy cemeteries. So, Old San Juan, walking around. So after World War II, there were proposals to rebuild the old town with more modern architecture. Luckily, civic leaders decided to preserve the historic character instead. So zoning laws actually changed to favor building, remodeling, and incorporating Spanish colonial motifs in any new construction. So you can kind of, even new buildings kind of look like old buildings. We also have similar overlays in New Orleans. Preserve the city's architectural traits, which has been key then to San Juan's status as a tourist destination. That we can park the ship, go off, go kind of straight up the hill, left, right, center, and kind of see this gorgeous architecture still standing. Cathedral San Juan Bautista. Excuse me. This is street art, of course. We'll have a larger street art portion, but there's a little bit pieces and parts in Old San Juan, which is kind of fun. So the Cathedral of San Juan Bautista is one of the oldest buildings in San Juan, and it's the second oldest cathedral, the first being in the Dominican Republic and the Americas. So the first was a wood cathedral in 1521. Several times have been destroyed by hurricanes, and so the current structure here was roughly dating to 1540 and reshaped in later centuries, the last time in 1917. Speaking of, on the island, it's roughly 56% Roman Catholic, 33% Protestant, which is largely Pentecostal, and the other 2% atheist, 1% none, 1%. In the cathedral, you'll have the tomb of Ponce de Leon. In 1521, he organized a colonizing expedition to what is now the southwest coast of Florida. They were attacked by braves and indigenous there. He was injured, likely poisoned by a poisoned arrow. He died on his way back to Havana in Cuba and was then buried in Puerto Rico, eventually transferred to the cathedral. I promised you pirates, and this is a preview. Look at this guy. Just yoked. Trying to get remembered. I just want to remember it as a 22-year-old version of myself. But so Roberto Cofresi is the pirate I'm going to be talking about in a couple days, and so I suspect many of you have not heard of him. So he's of noble extraction, via Trieste, which at the time was under the Habsburgs, and likely his name came from the Austrian town of Kufstein. So his father fled Trieste due to murder charges. He was in a duel, he's kind of in gray work, I'll expand more in my other talk. Found himself in Cabo Rojo, Puerto Rico, which is on the completely opposite side of San Juan. If you want to be in the gray areas, smuggling, piracy, stuff like that, don't do it right next to either do it right next to the capital and kind of integrate yourself, or completely on the other side of an island. So that's what they're doing. He's the last of the major pirates of the Caribbean, and operated about 100 years after the golden age of piracy ended. So he did poorly during the gradual decline of the Spanish Empire. In 1820s, there's lots of kind of independence movements going on. Started as a fisherman, gained knowledge of the terrain, and then moved to piracy. Hit one of his major ships, so this is the last battle, so his is the Anne on the right-hand side. It was a small, quick vessel, choosing speed over power, and he attacked trade routes around Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and St. Thomas. It was moving quick, get out quick. So here's his area of operation. So he kind of based on this tip of Puerto Rico, and then it was a fairly like a small ship, so kind of stayed in the littoral or the coastal areas, and so really angered a lot of colonial authorities. So the Spanish were so embarrassed that they actually went and asked the Danish and the United States for help. So this combined group set a trap. They disguised a gunship as a merchant vessel, and then essentially were able to capture him. I'll expand a lot of these threads in my other talk. He was executed outside of El Moro, so there's a large field right outside, and so he was executed very quickly, actually, and then tried to bribe his way out, that's the hustle, right? And then buried just outside the wall next to that cemetery I told you, because criminals were not allowed in the cemetery itself. So he was his body was hung there as a warning. Shifting over to art. So Santurce is the region that's kind of very close to the port. It's about a 10-minute, public buses, I think they're actually free most days, or a 10-minute quick cab ride, about a 45-minute walk. But there's a result of community of artists coming together to fix up essentially a forgotten or rundown neighborhood. There's blocks and blocks of these murals. So I kind of told you in Curacao, and a number of you went on that walking tour. It's kind of more tucked away. There's a lot going on here. So it sits just 10 minutes outside of Old San Juan, and it's one of the island's most free-spirited neighborhoods. So it's where many artists claim that the street art movement started in Puerto Rico. It's really 1980s, 1990s, kind of picked up in the aughts and teens. Over the years, it's become one of the largest art districts, actually, in the Caribbean, and quite large in general. Diane and I really seek these types of things out, and we were quite impressed. Also in this district, the Museo de Arte of Puerto Rico, and there's a tour of that I know being offered. So it's an expansive collection of art from the Caribbean and beyond. If you can get a guided tour, I very much recommend it. They do a stellar job. It's so much more than just an art museum. Hosts concerts and events on its museum grounds. So the outside is this nice garden, sculpture garden, and then very peaceful and kind of an oasis in the city.
Where's that located at?
It's this would be another 10 minutes, so it's about 20 minutes from the ship. It's pretty easy. And there is a direct bus. Actually, if you don't mind public buses, it doesn't take that much long. It doesn't take that long at all. So it's just slightly to the southeast of the port. Moving outside the city, El Yunque Rainforest is another thing that many of you might go for. So variety of trails and hikes, about 240 plant species endemic to Puerto Rico, and some of the best bird watching on the island. You might catch a view of woodpeckers, green mangoes, and even the Puerto Rican carrots. In here, Cocoa Falls, so this is the only tropical rainforest in the United States, and it's about 28,000 acres. It receives over 200 inches of rain a year in some areas sometimes. And it's the sacred place in Puerto Rican culture. It comes from the Tano word yuke, or white earth, reference to the clouds that gather around the mountainous peak. It might also come from the deity of fertility. Talked about this in my earlier talk on James Bond, but the Arecibo Observatory, it's 1963. Not going to be able to see it on this trip. It's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, but it's kind of James Bond fans might recall the scene where Pierce Brosnan's Bond fights with a rogue business agent over the huge satellite bowl. So it also starred in the movie Contact. And in 2020, two of the main kind of support cables collapsed. And in 2022, the whole thing collapsed. And kind of a fun screenshot from the film. As always, and I'll kind of do this as a, we don't have time to break up into groups, and I don't like to rush you. So, flag quiz, 3 sides of a triangle are actually, so thinking of this constitutional role, Puerto Rico has the same 3 branches of government. Yes, correct. Blue, and then that star is just for the island itself. So blue, looking up, looking out. What is our guesses?
Sea and sky.
Yeah, the sea, the sun, so nice. And then this is where it takes a turn. So, so red, we've talked about red before, like, oh, maybe it's soil, maybe it's, what do you, blood, yes, yeah, then you're like, whoa, hey, calm down. But yes, bloodshed, kind of the Puerto Rico has kind of this history, not of violence all the time, but has this line of it. And then white, thinking doves.
Peace.
Yeah, peace again. So 3 branches of government, sea and sky, blood, and then peace is to round it out. Citations, as always. I've got some academic works in here because I've studied a lot on the history of Puerto Rico, so forgive me for that. I always like to end my talks by showing you what I've got going on ahead. So this is the schedule down here. If you ever want to go back to one of these that is on TV, you don't see me wandering around my jungle gym, but you will hear me with the slides. The Last Pirate is going to be expanding on that pirate I gave you a little bit of a taste for. Rums of the Caribbean is just a talk, it's not a tasting. You can bring your own rums and I'll work them in. Actually, Bacardi has a role in Mount Gay, so the things that are offered on here. And then a Q&A, this hopefully might be a little fun. Diane and I, because we own and operate a cidery, we make stuff, we have a deep knowledge of the alcohol industry in the US and around the world. So I like to end with philosopher Simone Weil in 1942. She was writing to a friend before TV was a big thing, before cell phones, all these. Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And you've provided that to me today. So I thank you very much. And I hope you learned something new about the island. Have a good rest of your morning.